Hello and welcome back to the Puncher's Chance podcast with myself, Sam Hill, and as always I'm joined by
Harry Toey
and
Ben Thomas.
And in today's episode we are lucky to be joined by a special guest, the man who has been the voice, the eyes behind Welsh Boxing for a number of years now, Dewi Powell. How you doing?
I'm all good, thank you. I wouldn't go that far, but I do appreciate the sentiment.
Now the reason I say that obviously is because you've been the man behind KO Cymru, sort of the leading, I say, voice behind Welsh Boxing. You've given Welsh Boxing a platform that it didn't have previously. What was the reason for that in early 2022 to get that started?
So I've been covering Welsh Boxing specifically since I was about your age, about 18 years old. I just had a passion for it. I was never going to be a fighter. Learned that quickly. I can remember doing in school. We had an old pro, Woody Greenway, who's a bit of a journeyman. I think he'd won about 8 fights and lost about 32. And did a couple of sessions in school, and I was more athletic than I am now, but I just realised it was just so hard. But I just loved it, just loved boxing, and my way into it was covering it. So did what you guys are doing now, my late teens, and then throughout my 20s, ran a website called Boxing Wales, and that came to an end about probably 6 months before KO Cymru started. And the idea behind KO Cymru is just to champion Welsh boxing. It doesn't mean that I agree with everything that goes on, and I like to think I call out things that I don't agree with. But that's only ever done with the sort of interest of Welsh boxing as a whole. So yeah, massively passionate about boxing. I think it's might be the worst business, but it's the best sport in the world. Isn't that nothing more thrilling than a good fight? And I think you can kind of get that from, if you look at the fan base of boxing, you'll have your hardcore boxing fans, but the casual audience is so big. It's usually people who are more passionate about other sports, but where the fighting is metaphorical in football or rugby or whatever else, it's literal in boxing. And I think there's just that primal instinct of just seeing two highly tuned fighters, male or female, that I just really admire. And I think it's the ultimate test of character, ultimate test of skill and decision making. And yeah, just always been massively into it. And from doing what I've done over the past 14 years, predominantly been in print. I did journalism in university and specialised in print in second year, in magazines in third year, and it was purely for the love of the Boxing News magazine, trade publication. Always loved it, since I was a teenager, and been lucky enough to contribute a couple of times over the years. But obviously since I would say video, definitely. By the time I was finishing university, around 2013, video and podcasts were coming into it. But I'd say like the last 5 years, it's absolutely flown off, isn't it? That's probably why you're doing this format. You're not doing. I know you do your written stuff, Ben, but you're not doing, focusing on print so much, or digital print. For want of a better term, it's podcasts and that radio format survives so well, doesn't it? That it makes a lot of sense. So a couple more podcast appearances like this. Lately?
Yeah, you were on the BBC Wales recently talking about obviously Welsh boxing and highlighting some of the big fight coming up, obviously Lauren Price and stuff. Would you say, you said your aim was to champion Welsh boxing? Do you think you've succeeded in a way to do that? Do you think Welsh boxing in a better place now? Not necessarily through to yourself entirely, but do you think that's fair to say?
I think Welsh boxing is in an okay place. To be honest, the small hall scene is busy and it's active, and there are numerous shows a year where previous years we may have 4 or 5 small hall shows, or maybe less. They do seem to be a lot more frequent, but I kind of think Welsh boxing happens in sprints. Obviously we've got Lauren Price next week, Joe Cordina the week after, a couple of weeks after that we've got 2 Welsh title fights, and you get these lulls in between. And the Welsh boxing really doesn't benefit from big promoters. Obviously, Boxer are here next week. Matchroom were here last year, but there are massive gaps between when those appearances happen. So what typically happens, and I don't know if you've watched Ben Crocker's fight back from the weekend, but George Groves made a point, which I thought was interesting for an English person to make the point, that Welsh boxers tend to have to take tests early. They tend to have to go in away corners early. They have to fight for their chance. And no boxer has it easy. It's not an easy sport. And like I touched on earlier, the business is a lot worse. But no boxer, I'm not saying, it's easy to make it if you're from the other side of the bridge. But I think it's harder to make it if you're from this side of the bridge. And you've got Lauren Price, Joe Cordina, Rhys Edwards and Brandon Scott, the whole base of professional Welsh boxers. We've got 4 signed to and Gavin Gwynn actually, with Frank Warren. We've got 5 signed to mainstream promoters, which I think if you were going back to, say, the Joe Calzaghe days, it was like 5 or 6 in one gym, and there were others around the country as well. So it's doing okay, but I would stretch, even if Lauren had a win next week, which would be amazing. It could be better.
I think we're going to talk about that next week. But what's your take on the Welsh titles then? Obviously, we've got 2 fights coming up. Do you think they need to be fought more often?
They do need to be more active. I would say they're more active now than they've been over the last 10 years. I'd say they're probably never been as active as they are now. What tended to happen before, they're predominantly put on by Sanagar events. Mm-hmm. But what tended to happen before is that the Sanagar events would only do those if they had like an S4C or Eurosport around, where now they seem to happen on those non-televised shows as well, which is good. And I think the value of the Welsh Championship is that these bills need to happen where prospects are fighting journeymen and there's almost no risk of them losing. There are things to learn from those fights. You don't need too many of them, but these shows are inevitably going to be predominantly based with those fights. Mm-hmm. The problem is that if you only ever have those, and this has happened too often in the past, you almost forget that it's a sport. Is it just an event? Is it just an event for people to have a good night out, and the sport comes secondary then? So you need these Welsh title fights. There needs to be an element of competitiveness, and I understand that these shows, are really about building prospects up, and hopefully one of them gets a chance with a big promoter. But at the same time, it becomes a bit of a farce if we don't have things like Welsh title fights. And I think, like, for me, what some of the best fights I've seen, honestly, have been Welsh title fights. I remember Chris Way against Frankie Borg was an absolute thriller. Angelo Dragoni against Christian Toos was a thriller. There's loads.
Conor McIntosh, Rashid Omar as well.
Yeah, that was an absolutely fantastic. Yeah. Probably because it was at the start of the year, everyone forgot about it by the end of the year. It was one of the best fights I saw that year. But yeah, some of the best fights I've seen are Welsh title fights, and we need them. They need to be a platform to kick on. Yeah. I think I quite like how Lloyd Jermaine did it. Won a Welsh title, wanted a Celtic title next, and then got his opportunity. Didn't work out, but he got his opportunity then on a Matchroom show. And I think that's the value of them. They give you championship experience. They give you something to bargain with, something to show your worth, rather than I've got a 10-0 or 12-0 record and I haven't beaten anyone. You've at least had one competitive fight. You will develop as a fighter. You won't get into bad habits against someone who's not coming to win. And like I say, I understand those fights need to happen, but maybe not so many.
What's your thoughts on it being called an area title?
It's not anymore.
Is it not anymore?
No, it's not anymore.
Okay.
So
Happy
probably
days.
I would guesstimate maybe about 6
months
ago.
It's still only one
judge. Yeah,
I was just going to come on to that. Yeah, I've got. That's
Is that the
issue.
thing that you don't? Like,
yeah, that
should be
issue.
3 judges.
Because we spoke to Tony Borg about this, and he was pretty passionate, and he's someone who is quite passionate about Welsh boxing, obviously from what he's done. He said the first thing he said to us pretty much was that the Welsh titles need more judges. They need to be seen as an equivalent to the English belts, which they should be.
I
really.
think a lot of them have said as well, in terms of with there being like a one judge system, it can be a bit of a risky fight to take in as well, because you're going to have obviously 2 fighters in Wales that are of a decent level, and I don't think neither of them want to get in there taking the risk of there's only one judge, they could lose it.
And to build on that as well, some of the worst scorecards I've seen have been in Welsh title fights. That, not to pick on Christian Toos, but that Christian Toos Angelo Dragoni fight was like 100% won it. I don't care what view you have of it. I was sat next to Christian Toos' corner, and they didn't think they won that fight. And there's been other ones. Jacob Robinson against Angelo. Jacob ran away with it. On the cards, he won by 1 point, and the difference was a knockdown that was given that wasn't a knockdown. Like I'm not going to name names, but there's one official I'm concerned about. But in fairness, it's a hard job not to just judge a fight, but to referee it at the same time. They're 2 completely different jobs. One is meant to keep a lid on the action, keep the boxers behaving within the rules of the game or the fight. And the other one is to judge who's winning. They don't really, for a 4 and a 6 rounder, it might be obvious. For a 10 rounder, it's a really hard task, I think, to do both. But the English title used to be one judge, which was the referee. Tyson Fury fought John McDermott in their first fight and got battered and won. Terry O'Connor was the referee, and they changed things after that. And
because a lot of people say Fury lost that, didn't
100% lost it. Yeah,
I think I've watched that one back, and you can see.
I think if you asked Fury, he would admit that he lost that. And again, that was one of those where it wasn't really debatable. It was pretty clear that John McDermott deserved the decision, but Fury's the up and comer. John McDermott didn't quite look like a fighter. Wasn't obviously as fashionable, and that happens too often in boxing as well. But interestingly, you can have 3 judges in a Welsh title fight, but the promoters choose not to because of the costs involved. So to give you an example, Campbell Hatton fought, name escapes me, last fight that he lost for the Central Area title. They had 3 judges for that because Matchroom were happy to pay it. The promoters on the small hall scene, where the margins between profit and losses are so fine, the promoters don't want to pay for another 2 judges. That's another 2 travel expenses, overnight stays, fees, or it would be 3, wouldn't it? Because the referee wouldn't be doing it. But in the interest of fairness, it definitely should be 3 judges. That's the main issue with Welsh title fights. And I appreciate the cost for the promoter goes up, but the cost potentially to a boxer could be make or break on their career at this level.
It's the crazy thing, because even when you watch boxing at the highest level, the amount of times we've sat in this room and gone, that's just boxing, isn't it? Like, they shouldn't have lost that fight, but that's just boxing.
It's just something you get used to as a fan of boxing. There's you see so many bad scorecards, and it's just.
But if that's happening at the top level with the 3 judges, the frequency in which it must be happening at the bottom with just the referee is like you say, it seems far too often. It's a shame, because we spoke with Gavin, and he said boxing's not. If you want to make money, don't become a boxer. For a lot of these guys, it's not until you get to the very top. And how many people we could have seen get to the very top if they'd had a decision go their way, you never know.
There's that saying, isn't there, in boxing? I don't think it's founded in fact, but it probably is true that 1% of boxers make enough money to live off for the rest of their career. In Welsh boxing, I would say it's less than that.
Yeah, what boxer from Wales would do?
Calzaghe.
Calzaghe is probably the only one, and
probably Calzaghe, Cleverly, Enzo,
Lee Selby, maybe.
Yeah, Lee Selby, maybe. Lauren Price and Joe Cordine are probably going to be should be okay. But compared to how many that is, it's such a low number, isn't it?
Yeah. Like you said, it is more difficult, I think, for Welsh fighters to sort of get that platform where they're consistently being pushed out there compared to, see the likes of someone like Ben Whittaker, who's just starting his career and he's everywhere.
You see it with Lauren Price, because boxer signed Lauren Price, they also signed Caroline Dubois. Caroline Dubois is a good fighter. She is going to go on to do very good things. But the hype that Lauren gets compared to Caroline Dubois, you can't really compare them. And I appreciate Caroline Dubois is stopping people, but Lauren is looking electric. She hasn't really put her foot wrong yet. She hasn't
lost a round.
She's an Olympic gold medalist as well.
I know.
If you see an English Olympic gold medalist, they push to the moon as soon as they're out.
It's the type of thing though you can't really raise it as an issue because people think it's an excuse. But I haven't done this for so long, I know it's not.
And Wales is home to some brilliant trainers. You've got the likes of Gary Lockett, a legend of the game. Tony Borg, has had world champions. You've got obviously Chris Sanagar, who is not a trainer, but his gym has multiple world, European. Enzo Macronelli, Lee Selby, the names we've mentioned. Should Welsh boxing be in a stronger place, considering the heritage it's got? I mean, Merthyr's probably the smallest town in the world to have multiple world champions.
Yeah, when I was growing up, I grew up in a little tiny village called Tirabirth. It's got a football field, post box, chippy. That's it. But you'd go 5 minutes one way, Kevin Forrest, Nathan Cleverly, Robbie Regan, both world champions. I could go 10 minutes another way, to Gatley Gate, Di Gardner's gym. He's trained numerous world level fighters. You could go 10 minutes another way, Joe Calzaghe was there. 2 minutes another way, Esther and Munich, where Lauren Price is from. That was kind of what I think probably piqued my interest in boxing. But I always make the point that there was a point in time where you could argue Joe Calzaghe was the number one boxer in the entire pound for pound best in the entire world. Jimmy Wilde was. There's a point in time. Pound for pound lists obviously weren't a thing back then, but he was recognised the best boxer of his time. So, has Wales ever won a Football World Cup? No. Have we ever come close to, with semi-finals in the rugby? We've never won a Rugby World Cup, have we? Boxing is Wales' most successful sport. I know, we've got 4 recognised organisations where you could become a world champion. So I appreciate the point that, there's not 4 Rugby World Cups. But if you strip away that and just say, right, who from Wales has been the number one, not just best in their weight, best in the entire sport, we've had that happen twice in boxing. You could argue Lauren Price did that as an amateur. She won she won the World Championships, Commonwealth Games, European Games, Olympics. Most decorated British amateur boxer of all time. Have we, I don't know, but have we had another amateur sport where a Welsh representative has been the best of all time? Maybe Paralympics, someone like Tanni Gray-Thompson, I don't know, but Welsh boxing has always punched above its weight, but it's just because the sport is so disorganised compared to football and rugby, and it's a bit of a wild west, and everyone is a sort of sole trader, if you like, that it gets lost. And the BBC in Wales do a good job of shining a spotlight on it. In times gone by, papers like the South Wales Argus have, but Wales Online don't really have a lot of interest in boxing that I see. They haven't plagiarised me in about 6 or 7 years. Well, that used to be a common thing, but it's just, you're right, if you look at if you wrote down the achievements compared to the profile, it doesn't really match up.
Do you think these organisations could do a better job, though, of sort of pushing Welsh boxing? Because obviously, everyone's going to be down here now next week for Lauren Price and pushing that fight, and then if she wins a world title, it'll be a lot around her for a couple of weeks probably, but then it'll just go quiet then until Cordina or her come back to Cardiff, and you've got her fighting for a world title, but then you've got the Welsh title fights in 3 weeks after that. You probably won't see no coverage of it whatsoever.
I think, as much, I know, not having a dig, but as much as, I comment on the media there, I do think that people in boxing also need to pull their finger out. I think that, I don't see for most of these shows happening in Wales, and this might make me unpopular, but it's the truth. The promoter will put together a poster, might do some social media posts. They don't do any press. They don't do the promotional activities. It's kind of left to the boxer to sell the tickets, and that's the way small hall boxing is, and that's the way it is for most Welsh prospects who get on the big shows. They're there to, if we take Matchrooms, if you take Cordina against Ogawa, for example, the event wasn't confirmed until 4 weeks before it was happening. There was no undercard until 10 days before it. I think Ben Crocker and Kieran Jones both had a fight the week after, and they doubled up just because it was their opportunity to get on, because they could shift 100 tickets or 100 plus tickets. This is why I'm so relieved for the show coming up, because what's tended to happen over the years is Welsh boxers will be added onto these shows. They'll be the first or second on, and they're there purely to sell tickets. Or if they're on the show, they'll be there to be beaten. They'll be in the away corner against a quality fighter who's coming over here. I remember the McGuigans did a show in the Ice Arena years ago, and it was like, it felt like every title fight was apart from the main event, which was someone from Bristol, Lee Haskins, against a Mexican, and it was in Cardiff, of all places. All the meaningful fights on the show, it was like a Welsh fighter there to be beaten in the away corner. But this one next week, we've got Rhys Edwards is in a really meaningful fight against Thomas Patrick Ward. Kieran Jones is fighting another Welshman who's 3-0, Lewis Howells. Kane Shepherd is fighting the Midlands area champion Ishmael Ellis. So it feels like that, if they win, they might get another chance. Where before I felt like if they win, unless they do something incredible like Brandon Scott talking about losing his virginity, unless they do something like that, they're never gonna get back invited, or they're never gonna be invested in.
Is Brandon a sort of because we've spoken quite a lot with Brandon, and he's great to interview because you don't have to do any work. You just stick a mic in front of him and let him go on. Is he the sort of character you need in boxing, or particularly in Welsh boxing, to just because he's really just grabbed it by the scruff of his neck and gone, yeah, do you know what, I'm going to make it to the top. However, it takes me to do so.
To put himself out there, and
that's what I mean about people need to do a little bit more. I always say, whenever I have this conversation with fighters, I always tell them, especially being from this part of the world, being good enough isn't good enough. You need something else. So like Rhys Edwards, I don't know if you've ever seen Rhys Edwards' TikTok. He has got millions and millions of views of him, either highlights from his fights, or the one that went crazy in lockdown was his partner trying to take his head off with a pillow.
I've seen that one.
I
have seen that one.
That went massive. ESPN in America reposted that one. But I've no doubt when Boxer was signing him, they would have been really encouraged to see that sort of thing. So I'm not saying it's fair or it's right, but being a good fighter isn't enough. You need to appeal to people. You need to relate to people. I think that's why Lauren Price, is just such a normal person. Most people feel like they could go up to her and have a conversation. There doesn't seem to be any sort of airs or graces about her. That's the bit I think that doesn't happen so much. And it's not rocket science. I think they just have conversations. You don't need to do anything outlandish. Brandon's a bit of a unique example, isn't he? He's in his personality so different compared to the boxing community. He is always going to stand out, and he's done a great job of promoting himself in that way. But for most people, I don't agree that people resonate with plonkers and idiots. Like, you don't have to be a fool or really rude or whatever. Like, you see a boxer every now and again will come along and their USP is to be as outrageous as possible. I think if you look at boxers who actually sell tickets, your likes of Nathan Heaney, Josh Warrington, they've done so because they're nice, normal people, and the people in their communities want to see them doing well for that reason. It's not done because they're throwing tables at press conferences or spitting in someone's face. Like, usually that's just heavyweights, but do you know what I mean? Like, you just need to be active and put yourself out there and have a bit of a plan. Where I think a lot of boxers at this level, they're not just training in the evenings, they're working as well. This is also another problem with Welsh Boxing. The lack of sponsorship means that we've got hardly any full-time pros. So they're juggling many things. And if you want a family life, if you want to do nice things and have nice things, you've got to work. Otherwise you'll be living on the breadline to fight for not very much money on a small hall scene every now and again. It's just not a way to live.
We've seen that with Jay Harris, haven't we?
Yeah.
Recently, he's still working full-time. Gavin Gwynn, I want to say as well, he's British champion, still working full-time as well.
Yeah, well, Jay was working part-time in an Amazon warehouse when he had his world title shot, which I don't... Would that happen in any other sport?
It's mental, that.
It takes me back to the days of the 80s when rugby wasn't professional, and you had players who couldn't go on a Lions tour because they had to work and they couldn't make any money from the sport.
I think Gavin said recently on an interview with Queensberry that he was close to quitting while Commonwealth champion because he was like, I don't know if I can make a living out of this. Yeah. Like, he's the Commonwealth champion, for God's sake. That should be enough to be like, yeah, do you know what? I can do this professionally.
It's the type of sport where you've got to throw everything at it all now. Like, in terms of, I think especially with the Welsh fighters, like, you've got to take that risk of going full time and trying to get that. Like, it's obviously worked out for Gavin. Like, has it been 4 years since he turned over as a full-time pro, and the stuff he's gone on to, he's probably massively overachieved now in terms of what he should have done, but with some people it's not always going to work out like that, is it really?
Yeah, when you look at Gavin as well, I remember seeing Gavin on the amateur scene, and he came to boxing, I think he'd been around boxing in his younger teens, but I think he took it seriously from 19, 20 years old, and always one of the hardest workers in the room. And I think boxing is one of those sports. I've seen Shane McGuigan say it. Talent's overrated. Hard work. You can always make it to a degree. You can always make up for a bit of talent with hard work. I think you look at what Gavin's done in his career. I think I counted before. I think there were 14 what I call Triple Crown champions. People who've won the British, Commonwealth, and European. And you look at the boxers he's beaten for that. Luke Willis was unbeaten for the British. All Southpaws actually, as Sean McComb was unbeaten for the Commonwealth. Marcelli was obviously unbeaten for the European. Hasn't had it easy at all. I think Gavin is a perfect example. If you wanted to sit down an amateur boxer who's about to turn pro, I would want them to speak to Gavin Gwynn, because he can tell you exactly what it takes to get somewhere in your career. Gavin probably won't fight for a world title, but he should be, maybe before his last fight, he should be world rated. And to come from where he's been, no backing as an amateur boxer, made it to the Welsh squad at the very tail end of his amateur career, to see where he's gone now, I think it's probably since Lee Selby, I think Gavin is the biggest success story in British boxing. In Welsh boxing.
I think, I find it interesting how Gavin and Lee sort of mirror each other a little bit in many ways. When we spoke to Tony, he speaks about them very similarly in terms of they turned up and they worked hard and they got what they earned, basically. We've been quite negative, not quite negative, but we've been fair on Welsh boxing. It's not all bad. There is, I'm sure, some top moments. And is there anything that sticks in your mind as a great moment where you go, that was a great fight or a memory or an event of Welsh boxing where that sticks in your mind as like that was the pinnacle?
Probably the best moment I've had sitting and working at ringside was Joe Cordina chinning Ogawa to become world champion. I can remember looking up, I was typing, so I was just settled. If you remember, the first round was like a bit of back and forth. It was just sort of settling in. I can remember literally sitting back in my chair, being like, oh, this is going to be a good long fight. And end of the round happened. I was typing a little bit longer, heard the bell go, and I looked up just as Joe was throwing the shots. And I was like in a trance. And I don't know if you know, Dan Williams does a lot of the stuff in Gary Lockett's corner. And Dan is about as tall as his table. He's only a small fella. He was on the shoulders of Chev Clark, and it was just surreal. You were seeing Ogawa flopping about, Chev Clark bouncing around with Dan on his shoulders. Josh Buatsi was commentating, but more or less in the ring. It was surreal, and I think we'd had a lot of big nights. Thinking back to like Liam Williams against Chris Eubank Jr. A couple of Nathan Cleverly fights I was at, big fights where it hasn't happened. And it just feels like such a sucker punch. And weirdly, I probably remember the disappointment more than the good times. I don't know why, it probably says something about me. But that was such a perfect moment. And obviously Joe lost the belt outside the ring after it, but I just think there's one moment in time. I think that was probably the best one punch finish, certainly in my time in Welsh boxing. But I would say, I spoke to Gareth Jones about it, and he said in his time, he probably could think of moments as good, but nothing that would supersede that. But there's been, if I look at, I can remember the first time I ever went to a fight and thought this is the best fight I've ever seen. It was Gavin Rees, against John Watson in Newport Centre, which I don't think exists now. There were a lot of good fights there, but I remember watching that and thinking this is one of the best fights I've ever seen. Back again a couple of years later in the Newport Centre. If there's some really dodgy footage of this on YouTube, and I would recommend anyone's got an interest in Welsh boxing, go and watch it. Tony Pace against Lance Sheehan. It was for what was called a British Masters title, which was like a unofficial diet British title, if that makes sense. You'd only ever see it on the small hall scene. And they did not defend themselves. They just attacked. It was silly. Tony was like out on his feet in the 6th round. I just reminded me, it was like a Welsh round 9 of Gatti versus Ward, and then he won every round afterwards. And the other best fight I've ever seen in Chicago, Nathan Cleverly against Andre Fonfara, which Nathan didn't win, but that was one again where the boxers didn't really defend themselves. It was all offense, and it was electric. Just a non-stop violent fight. And I'd probably, if I think about my favourite fighters, they do tend to be like sort of back foot skillful boxers or mid-range skillful boxers, but I think the best fights I've ever seen, and they've been the exact opposite of that.
Yeah, it does tend to be the way, doesn't it? The most talented boxers don't necessarily make the best fights always. I think people started to call Floyd Mayweather boring towards the end of his career. If you can call winning 50 fights boring, then that's.
I think most of the mainstream boxing fans all just want to see knockouts now, so they just want to see two people in there just swinging at each other instead of the technical side of boxing.
Yeah, if you got a favourite fighter, be that Welsh, be that British world, is there someone in your you stick that's my
ever?
Yeah, ever. Why not?
Roberto Duran. Yeah, 100%. I can remember.
That was Gavin's answer.
That was Gavin's. Yeah. Gavin said his dream fight. We did dream card with him would be to fight Duran in the MGM Grand.
I have no desire to fight Roberto.
That was Gavin's dream.
But yeah, Roberto Duran would probably be my all-time favourite. But growing up, it was I was that Joe Calzaghe, Ricky Hatton era, and they were the first boxers that made me love boxing. The first fight I think I ever lived and wanted to know everything about would have been just before Hatton fought Mayweather. It would have been around Hatton Castillo time, and then it was from watching Hatton I discovered Miguel Cotto, who was the same weight as him for a brief time. Cotto had some absolutely electric fights at super light, what we now call super lightweight. Remember him fighting Ricardo Torres, but I don't think I ever watched any of these fights live. I think it was like when YouTube was becoming a thing, because these would have been at stupid o'clock. I can remember if Sky had like a late night show of like De La Hoya, I would either watch it overnight and annoy my parents, or I'd watch it very first thing the next morning. But yeah, I absolutely loved Cotto, and then it was from Cotto I think I found James Toney. If I had to do a top 5, it'd be Calzaghe, Hatton, James Toney, Roberto Duran, and did I say Cotto?
Yeah.
Around about those anyway. So
Yeah.
I tell you what, most, though, maybe Hatton aside, tend to be like mid-range boxers. But Duran would be my absolute number one.
Yeah, I think he just has a thing. It must be. Everyone loves Roberto Duran. He's I mean, obviously a top fighter.
very good fighter,
He
man.
was. You can't.
I think he's kind of
dispute
he's the perfect mix of boxer and fighter, because there's some fights, like if you looked at his first fight with Sugar Ray Leonard, he doesn't box, he fights him, and then there's like the fight against Iron Barkley where he kind of boxes him and beats him up, but then there's a fight against Davey Moore where he tears into him and it looks horrendous by the end of it. So that, I think this Duran could do predominantly probably a fighter, but could do a bit of everything that appeals to everyone. Whereas you look at that era, and it was like Tommy Hearns was just a sort of wrecking ball that wanted you on the end of his punches. Marvin Hagler, I'm not calling any of these one-dimensional, but they had their way of fighting. Sugar Ray was flat, could be nasty as well, but was more flashy. Where I think Duran did a little bit of all of them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's completely. I mean, obviously anyone's favourite fighter is completely fair, but he is one that you can see, and like he just sticks on. And Calzaghe's one that, I mean, the amount of times I've heard people in Wales say, "Oh, when we get the next Calzaghe, or when the next Calzaghe," is he, in your eyes, whether that be bias or not, the best British fighter of all time? Because I know that's what a lot of people have said. Would you say that's a fair?
I think you could make that case. I think Jimmy Wilde would be the best of British fighter of all time. From used to call him Tylerstown Terriers, born in Quakers Yard. I'd go with Jimmy Wilde, but like you could make the case for Calzaghe, couldn't you? I think my take on it is people in Wales massively overrate Joe, and people not in Wales massively underrate him. You either seem to be like all in, or you have like loads of doubts. But I think if you look at his record, the number of world champions that he fought, the problem Joe had is, in retrospect, they were just too far spaced out. There were too many fights in there that people didn't care about. But that was just the time. I think if you like, Hatton was probably near 40-0 before he fought Costa Zoo for a world title. Joe got his world title earlier, but probably still at 25 when he became world champion, probably still had some learning to do. So that's why he wasn't thrown in. But amongst that, there's loads of fights Joe had, like when he fought Byron Mitchell, but there should have been a unification because Byron Mitchell just got robbed against Van Ottigan. You think of Joe's journey then, there was years between fighting Byron Mitchell and fighting Jeff Lacey. So it could have been very different, but I think it's slightly unfair to look at it. Pardon me. I think it's unfair to look at it through the lens of today, because I think there's so much more money in boxing now. Unifications are a lot easier to make.
It's funny you mentioned Jimmy Wilde, and I'll bring this up just as an opportunity to bring up
Here we go.
on the podcast. I am a descendant of one of the few men who beat Jimmy Wilde.
Wow.
Tansy Lee in London. He beat him in his first loss. I've got a little newspaper clipping of that fight. It's on YouTube as well. Have you seen that? The fight on YouTube. It was in 1933, and it was televised.
Surely you've seen that, but
It was. That was his.
I was there.
Asked his parents to stay up for it. But yeah, like, how mental is that you can get a fight from like the 30s on YouTube
and you can't even get Welsh boxers on YouTube as well.
you're not right.
Mad,
you can't watch.
Jordan Withers boxed last week. Probably one of the best prospects in Welsh boxing. Can't even see his fight.
Yeah,
it's a shame that.
But yeah, Jimmy Wilde is I think for me number one. But like again, you have to look. This is what I think doesn't happen when people look at boxing. Look back at boxing, they make their lists of top 10, whatever. But you've got to judge it for the time that it was, because they can't do it. There would be people, you would find someone on the internet that would look at Jimmy Wilde and Joe Calzaghe and they'd say, Joe won 4 bouts of super middleweight, Jimmy Wilde only ever won 1. They wouldn't get that there was only 1 at the time.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, not that he was doing it over 23-minute rounds or whatever scene it was at the time.
Yeah. You can find his grave very easily, Jimmy Wilde.
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast. I think it was a socially distant sports bar, and they mentioned that Jimmy Wilde had a ice cream shop in Barry. So I was driving to Barry to walk the dog on the beach, and I just asked my wife, I was like, just Google where Jimmy Wilde is buried. And it was like in a cemetery in Barry that we were passing anyway. So I popped into, I know it was a bit morbid and a bit weird, but popped in to see his grave. But yeah, there's so much history of Welsh boxing that people don't realise. There's a massive statue of Jim Driscoll outside the Radisson Blu in town, not too far from where we are now. Jim Driscoll, one of the best. You see these conversations, best British fighter not to win a world title. Jim Driscoll is the best British fighter not to win a world title. He was in the days of what we had, what we called newspaper decisions. So unless you knocked the champion out, you couldn't become the champion. So he fought featherweight champion called A Battle, only agreed to fight him over 10 rounds. So in those days, that was a short fight. Obviously, now it's almost the full length, isn't it? But and Driscoll battered him, didn't get got the newspaper decision, which is almost like an unofficial result back then. Didn't become champion, came back home, even though a rematch was offered because he'd promised to do a fundraiser for Nazareth House orphanage where he'd grown up in. So there's like an incredible story. And then he died really young. The day of his funeral, there were 100,000 people on the streets of Cardiff for his funeral, and it's almost like nobody knows that story, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the first I've heard of it. I knew he had a statue, but I didn't know the story behind it. I think Jimmy Wilde's one that hasn't got a statue. I thought they would have put one up in Merthyr. There's a couple. I think Johnny Owen has one.
Johnny Owen's got one in Merthyr. Howard Winston's got one in Merthyr.
Eddie Thomas as well.
Yeah. There's a lot. Merthyr's covered in them, to be fair.
Merthyr's. I'm trying to think where the other place. Oh, it's
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia's got 3 boxing statues. One of them isn't a boxer. It's Rocky Balboa. Joe Fraser, and I think it's Joey Giardello. And when I was in America recently, someone was claiming to me that it's the only city in the world with 3 boxing statues, and I was like, have you ever heard of Merthyr Tydfil? They're 3 within about, I don't know, probably within about 5 minutes of each other.
They're all in walking distance of each other.
Should do that one day. I need to go visit them all. To move more to the upcoming Lauren Price, the undercards and stuff, can we get a prediction from you on that main event from the man himself? Who do you think is going to win? What do you think the result's going to be?
I'm very confident that Lauren wins on points. I'm not confident it will be easy. I think there is stylistically, McCaskill will probably play into her hands. McCaskill is not very skillful, but she's very fit, very strong, very rough, and she could make things uncomfortable up close. Lauren's task is to keep it long and do what she does, keep her at range, ping her, keep circling, and she should outbox McCaskill. I probably don't have as much confidence of some people that it's going to be easy, and I guess it kind of comes just from in female boxing, and I don't think this will upset anyone, but it's kind of feast or famine. You either get like pretty limited domestic or European, if you like, standards, or you get very good boxers at world level. McCaskill is coming towards the end. She's nearly 40, but she's been at that level now for a number of years. I think after 6 fights, she gave Katie Taylor a really good fight, and then since then she's beaten Cecilia Breakhouse twice. It was probably the best woman in the world at the time. And I'm not saying that makes McCaskill the best woman in the world, but she's been competing with very good boxers, Chantal Cameron, Sandy Ryan. It hasn't always gone her way, but she's really experienced at that level. So I can see it being a bit, maybe, I probably couldn't see it being closer than 7 rounds to 3. But it could be 10-0, over the 10 rounds. But I don't think it's going to be as easy as most people in Wales would say.
Are you more confident with it being in Cardiff? Because, Jessica McCaskill's she's never lost a title defence, I believe. She's only ever lost when she's going for someone else's titles. Mm-hmm. And obviously there's a general idea you have to take the titles from a champion. if she was in her hometown and Lauren was the away fighter, would you be as confident that she'd get the result and the decision?
I'm probably never confident travelling away just because you see so many wild and wacky scorecards, but I'm usually quite cautious in sort of backing Welsh boxers too heavily because there's so many things that could go wrong in the sport. But I would kind of always be confident that Lauren Price would beat McCaskill. The margin of it may vary depending on where it was in the world. I'm sure if it was in Chicago, it would be probably closer on the cards. But I don't. Could I see Lauren Price definitely losing 6 or 7 rounds to McCaskill? I don't think so.
What about the undercard? Who should we look out for people that are just tuning in for the first time watching Welsh boxing?
Reece Edwards is kind of... If Lauren Price becomes the queen of Welsh boxing and Joe Cordine is the king, I'd say Reece Edwards could become the prince next Saturday. Reece is really skillful, featherweight, really busy, good on the eye and nice to watch. I think he will always be in good fights with his style. He's fighting Thomas Patrick Ward next week, who had a good run at a certain level, became British champion, beat Jazza Dickens, which I think looked like a better win in the years to come after it, even though it was a good win at the time. But Thomas Patrick Ward never really kicked on past that. Fought Komlatov in a world title eliminator and got dealt with. But I think it could be a case that matchup is really good timing for Reece, and you tend to find like the big promoters usually get it right in sort of how they bring people through at that level. You kind of see, and now there probably is going to be an opening for Reece when the likes of Nick Ball moving on to world level. I could see win this fight, and Reece really should be looking for those big domestic titles. I think they've got a WBA into something on the line.
Intercontinental it is, yeah.
Yeah, which it doesn't really mean much, but it'll give Reece an experience of championship boxing. He'll have to make the weight, and there'll be 3 judges and all of that piece. And I don't think he's ever been involved in a fight with 3 judges. I think the Brad Foster fight last time was just the one. But yeah, that's a good matchup, and it's kind of time now for Reece to kick on. He turned pro before the pandemic, raced up a load of wins, and then obviously the pandemic happened, which slowed things down. Mm-hmm. And I think even when the pandemic eased, he kind of was a little bit bored with boxing because he was on that small hall scene fighting guys he definitely knew he was going to beat, and then he's got these opportunities with Boxer. And from what he tells me, what his coach Gary Lockett tells me, he's really knuckled down over the last 6 to 9 months. And this is this fight is potentially a really big platform for him. Obviously, it's not just on Sky Sports. This one they've done a simulcast deal with BBC Wales. I don't know how much BBC Wales are showing, whether they're just showing Lauren's fight, but if they're not, and then they're going to show other fights on it, you'd imagine Reece would probably be the fight before Lauren. So potentially a massive window of exposure for him.
What about Moses Jolly as well? A heavyweight prospect.
It's hard to know how good Moses is, but there are a lot of positive signs. I remember his professional debut. He was all over the place, should I say. He was just way too excited. Got involved and never looked like he was going to lose, but he got caught a couple of times, and I thought, where is this going to take us? Like, because you can see he's got something. Since his professional debut, he seems to be a lot calmer, and I think he's kind of realising his potential. The one disappointing thing with Moses for next week is there's no opponent yet, and I know we're not expecting him to fight anyone who would pose too big a threat, but I think it does help to have an opponent named, so it'll just set the expectations. If he's fighting a banger, if he's fighting someone that we think he'll deal with early or late or whatever the expectation is, it's hard to have an expectation of Moses for next week because he doesn't yet have an opponent. The other 2 Welsh prospects on the card, Kieran Jones and Kane Shepherd, are both very good. Kane's a super featherweight, Kieran's a middleweight, both southpaws. I can remember Kieran, I love this story. When I was in 6th form, I was helping out a friend of mine coach some football, and my football advice is very simple. It is look up when you pass in, stop the ball from bouncing, and we were looking after year 7 kids, so it doesn't have to be very in-depth, just telling them to work as a team basically. And the team got to the final of this mini tournament they were in, and they lost on penalties to a school just up the road. and everyone after, maybe there was about 10 kids, everyone in the group was crying after the game, apart from one kid who looked fuming. And like I was thinking, like, it doesn't matter that much, does it? You know, you'll be playing again next week, I'm sure, and you'll forget about it. But I can remember he looked fuming. And then a couple of years later, saw him boxing, and it was Kieran Jones. And if there was a boxer who was meant for an individual sport, it was him. Because I could see he was just really not happy to be part of a team that had lost. And I don't think Kieran has lost to a Welsh boxer in a long, long time. He's fighting, I think, Lewis Howells next week, who I've not yet seen. I think he's been fighting across the country, 3-0 at the minute. But you would like to think Lewis Howells is looking at Kieran Jones as a big fat target. You know, this is my chance to gate crash the scene and get an opportunity on a big boxer show. So that, you know, that should be a really good fight. Kieran was a quality amateur, went to the 2018 Commonwealth Games, had a bad elbow injury after that, and then obviously the pandemic happened. But he's making solid progress as a pro, and I think now is the time to step into more competitive fights. And I think a fight like this next week really could be a good showcase for him.
It's his first fight as well against someone who hasn't got a loss on their record, which I know doesn't necessarily mean everything, but there is something to be said for holding on to that zero. A lot of fighters hold on to that zero like it's everything they've got, and it might, that guy's not going to want to lose that fight. You've built out yourself up over 3 fights. He's not gonna want to just step aside for Kieran Jones to have his moment in Cardiff at all.
I'd be amazed if he came and tucked up, like he's going to be coming to win, you'd imagine. So yeah, should make for a good fight.
June 1st as well. Ryan Pocock, Ethan George. Are you going to give us some sort of prediction with that, or are you going to be a bit like Ben and sit on the fence because you don't want to offend?
No, I won't sit on the fence. I mean, I don't really care if it offends anyone, if I'm honest. Like, it's only my opinion, and I don't think anyone should be too upset.
Well, Ryan put us all on the spot when both of them were in the room when we did the press conference last time. So me and Sam were trying to think of ways of making our excuse, but yeah, Ben sat on the fence and got splinters.
Yeah, I probably think Ethan George would win, which might not please Ryan. But I just commend them both for taking this fight. Like I touched on earlier, we need meaningful fights on the small hall scene, and if one of them loses, it doesn't need to be end of the world. You look also on this show, Jake Tinkling is fighting Angelo Dragoni. Wasn't long ago, Jake Tinkling lost to Lloyd Jermaine for a Welsh title, really underperformed. Since then, gone on to a Celtic title fight, which didn't go his way, but he's become Welsh champion, and now he's fighting Angelo Dragoni. So, whoever wins or loses out of Ethan and Ryan, it doesn't need to be the end. They could go into another. I'm sure there'll be plenty that they would learn either way. I think Ethan is probably more, even though they've had almost exactly the same experience as a pro, to me, Ethan feels a little bit more seasoned. Good amateur, reached the Welsh final. I think he's kind of found his feet as a pro. Dipped way too low down in weight when he was trying to do light middleweight. He's gone up to super middleweight now, and going off his last performances, that they are the type of knockouts and knockdowns that I remember him doing repeatedly on the amateur scene. So I think super middleweight is where he belongs. Obviously, Ryan's been stopped before, which I think would probably appeal to Ethan when this was offered. But the interesting aspect is that they were gym mates for a little while as well. So I'm sure both of them have taken the fight for that reason. They've probably seen something in how the other one trains, however a spar went. They've probably seen something in each other that persuaded them that that this was a good idea. I'm sure they'll both be full of confidence, and like I say, you look at someone like Gavin Gwynn, what a Welsh title did for him. Look at someone like Lloyd Jermaine, and that's what Ryan and Ethan will be hoping a Welsh title does for them. The interesting bit with Ethan's potential history is that he's eyed becoming Llanelli's first Welsh champion for about 30 years, since I think it was Neil Haddock beat Steve Robinson. And if he was to win this fight, he would become a Welsh champion from Llanelli. Problem is now Angelo Dragoni's been added, so it looks like Ethan, if they were both to win, which may or may not happen, Ethan wouldn't become the first Welsh champion from Llanelli for 30 years. It'd be for about an hour, which is probably not what he was expecting not so long ago. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you boys have any more sort of general questions. What we do with all of our guests is we've got a thing where we ask what your dream fight card would be. So what that means is we ask you to pick 2 fighters. We'll run through it one by one. It can be from any era, different eras, dead, alive, anything like that. Different weight classes if you want. You pick a location, a venue, and then you fill it with a crowd or an atmosphere. So Ben went for the Welsh Wool, for example, the Welsh football fans. I think I went for Nathan Heaney's fans. So we'll start with 2 fighters. Is there 2 fighters, dead or alive, current, that you think, I wish I'd seen those 2 fight?
Going back to when I was younger, Ricky Hatton against Cotto. They were world champions at the same time at light welterweight, as it was known then. That would have just been an incredible fight. At the time, Cotto was with Top Rank. Hatton eventually was associated with Golden Boy, and before that, Frank Warren. So they would, at the time, it just wouldn't have happened that they would have got together. But that was the fight. I actually think a light welterweight, Hatton would have had a really good chance. Cotto was vulnerable then, probably a bit weight drained. But I think you look at his fights against like Ricardo Torres, Paulie Malignaggi, absolutely electric fights. And if I was to pick a venue for it, I think all Cotto fights should have been in Madison Square Garden with a Puerto Rican crowd. Imagine that Puerto Rican crowd you get at MSG with Ricky Hatton's fans who travel tens of thousands, across the Atlantic. That would be my dream. If I could, you often watch fights and like, I wish I was there. I almost feel nostalgic for a fight that didn't happen, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So that would be the one that would really, really appeal to me.
That's a good one, to be fair. The one I thought you were going to say was the one that Ben went for, which I think
most Welsh,
which is Carl Froch, Joe Calzaghe. That's the classic that obviously they say.
Yeah, I think wanted. I wouldn't have been confident with Hatton and Cotto either way, which way to go. I would have fancied Hatton, but I fancied Hatton against Miguel Pacquiao as well, and that went the way it went. But Calzaghe against Froch, both at their best, I'm pretty confident what would happen in that one.
Yeah, I think Calzaghe would have had that one, and I think if I mean, I'm saying this like I know anything, but if Carl Froch knew he would win that fight, he probably would have taken that fight. But I don't think he ever thought.
I think it just didn't line up for him, did it?
Yeah, it was a weird one because I think they were Joe was going to America at the end of his career, and Carl Froch, although it had good wins leading up to his world title fight, hadn't really had a world title win by then. I think by the time Froch fought Pascal, it was just never ever realistic that he was going to fight Joe. But it happens, and by the end of Froch's career, fair play, he fought George Groves twice, but he vacated his IBF title not to fight James DeGale. At some point, these eras have to end. Calzaghe had it as well. He was meant to fight Steve Collins, and Steve Collins suddenly became injured and retired rather than fight Calzaghe. And you kind of get it. At the end of your career, do you want to be fighting a young, hungry competitor that if you beat, you wouldn't get that much credit for? But on the flip side, I think it was probably good for Froch that he didn't fight Calzaghe, because he probably would have lost, and then would he have gone on to have the run that he had from Pascal through to George Groves. There was probably one routine fight in there, Yusuf Mack. All the other ones were just ridiculously tough fights, and he won most of them. So if he'd lost to Joe, I'm not sure he would have had the confidence, the same confidence that he had for that amazing run, which has ended up taking him all the way to the Hall of Fame.
We'll get one more prediction, since it's coming up this month. The unified title fight for Usyk.
Now this is
we've split opinion.
We're not going to say whose is whose, but this has been a talking point. Nearly fisticuffs in every episode when we talk about this.
We always talk about it in our episodes. Yeah.
I think all boxing logic says Fury. He is bigger. He could keep things long. If they come up close, he can use his size and lean on Usyk. But Usyk is, if I was to add a 6 to that list of 5 earlier, Usyk would probably be 6. There is something about Usyk that spooks Fury, and I think Fury will be a lot better than he was against Francis Ngannou, but he'll need to beat Usyk. Fury now isn't the elusive boxer that we remember fighting Vladimir Klitschko. He plants his feet. He's a lot more, I wouldn't say flat-footed, but he's a lot more of a stationary target. Usyk won't. I don't think Usyk will have as big a problem hitting him as people think. So yeah, I fancy Usyk to give him all sorts of trouble. What people overlook as well is, I think if you watched Fury against Wilder 3, you would come out that and you go, I don't think Deontay Wilder's going to be the same again. What you don't look at is Tyson Fury won that fight. He took an awful lot of damage The one punch he took, I think it was the first knockdown, and the slow motion of it, you see the ripple starts in his forehead and it continues all the way down his body. It was an unbelievable shot, and I think he hasn't quite been all in on boxing since that fight. We saw him fight Dillian White, easy fight for him really. I think we all knew it was going to go that way. Saw him fight Derek Chisora, which was a pretty disgraceful opponent to choose, and I think he chose that because he knew it would be easy. And then we saw him fight Francis Ngannou. I think he expected that to be easy and had the fright of his life during that fight. So I think Fury is past his prime more than most people would realise, and if there's anyone to show him up for it, it would be Usyk, wouldn't it? So I'm picking Fury, but I really fancy Usyk to give him all sorts of trouble.
Yeah, me and Ben have both gone for Usyk, and
It's the body with Usyk.
But
it's a long way down.
I don't
Fury.
think Fury is a body puncher.
The amount his hands are going to have to come down to get to Usyk's body is going to leave him open for all sorts of.
And you look at
we could go on forever for this.
The opponents that Fury has struggled with, I would say throughout his career, usually opponents that you don't expect him to struggle with. Think of like Steve Cunningham, Otto Wallin, definitely Ngannou. Usually when he's in I wouldn't say he struggled with Wilder, but they were tough fights. But when he is up against it, the Klitschko fight, the Wilder fights, he usually does raise his game. So I do think he will raise his game. That's probably in the back of my mind why I'm slightly leaning towards Fury. But if he is not on it, I think Usyk could really, really trouble him.
I just can't look past, especially since we've seen how AJ handled Ngannou and made him look like he should have an amateur
and how Usyk handled AJ, I suppose, as well. He made that victory look.
And that size difference as well, as much as it could be like the Fury's advantage, Usyk is kind of used to that now. And although he did fight heavy, basically cruiserweight in the amateurs, he did dip his toe in heavyweight numerous times. Fought Joe Joyce in the World Series of Boxing. So I don't think it's like a good big man beats a good little man or smaller man, because Usyk has fought heavyweights and had a lot of success in the past. And I think Tyson Fury, in years to come, when we look back at his career, we will say he was a good heavyweight of his time. I don't think he has the resume where you could say he's a great heavyweight. You look at Usyk's career, I think what he did at cruiserweight and what he's now gone on to do at heavyweight, it is a great career. So obviously, fine lines, you split in hairs. These are the best of the best. But I wouldn't shout you down for fancying Usyk to win that.
Fair enough. Well, like I just was saying, thank you so much, obviously, for your time and for joining us today.
Thank you.
Sorry for the technical issues beforehand, which seem to be a recurring.
Every time.
I'll give you this opportunity to plug anything you've got going on, or any channels, any accounts, anything like this you want to talk about real quick.
Just follow KO Cymru. I think I just plug all sorts of Welsh Boxing on there, from our elite amateurs to our novice pros to our world champions. And if you enjoy Welsh Boxing, I'm sure there'll be something on there for you.
Perfect, that's brilliant. Thank you guys all for tuning in. We'll catch you all next week when we talk about the big Lauren Price, Jessica McCaskill fight, and we'll obviously be down there for Fight Week as well. Thank you all for listening.